Hi, class. So today we're going to be starting a lesson on the Spanish-American War. We've kind of been talking about what the causes were, and this is going to be more of like a lecture on some of the consequences and what happened during the war. So that's what we're going to be doing in this lesson. So for an overview, just so you know what we're going to be talking about, some of the main takeaways, like the biggest takeaways, biggest points from this. So the Cuban movement for independence from Spain in 1895 is what brought American support. It garnered a lot of American support. And so when the USS Maine sank, the United States believed that the tragedy was the result of Spanish sabotage, and they therefore declared war on Spain. And the war itself lasted only 6 weeks and resulted in a pretty decisive victory for the United States. The future U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, also called Teddy Roosevelt, he became very popular. He rose to national prominence due to his role in the conflict. The other thing is that, although the United States promised it would not annex Cuba, and by annex I mean like take it over and take control of it and add it to the United States as a territory. They promised they wouldn't do that, but they did require Cuba to permit significant American intervention in Cuban affairs. So even though America didn't take it as a territory, it still got very involved in determining what Cuba was going to do in terms of international affairs. So, as a result of the war, the United States acquired the territories of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. So, we're going to talk a little bit about this conflict between empire and democracy. And so, in the late 19th century, really the nations of Europe, as we've discussed, were competing for overseas colonies in Africa and Asia. And many Americans thought that the United States should also enter this game of empires and demonstrate its growing power to the world. But in the United States, it hadn't really forgotten its own colonial past. When the American colonies had risen in revolt against the British, their frustration at obeying a government across an ocean really helped to define the American vision of representative democracy. And really taking on this role of a distant overlord, it seemed to some Americans like a violation of those principles of representative democracy and what inspired initially the American rebellion against the British. So at first, it looked as though the United States would not cave in to this temptation to become an empire. And for example, when in 1893, there was a group of American sugar plantation owners, and they engineered a coup to try to overthrow Hawaii's queen at the time, Liliuokalani, and to annex the Hawaiian Islands. And the United States refused actually to cooperate with these guys, with the American sugar plantation owners at first. They refused to cooperate with them and to engage in this scheme. But we're going to take a look at, does this really last? Does the United States manage to maintain its ability to resist the temptations of becoming an empire? And so, there's some trouble that starts to brew in Cuba a couple years later. So, not long after the Hawaiian coup, some disturbing news came from Cuba. So, in 1895, Cubans had risen in rebellion against Spain, which had been in control of Cuba since the 1500s. So the Spanish, they really tried to put down this rebellion, and they rounded up Cubans and forced them into reconcentration camps, as we learned on Friday. So these camps had very poor sanitation. Disease killed thousands that were being held there. And American newspapers, they were very eager to sell as many copies as possible, right? They're a business. They wanted to get people reading their stories. And so they whipped the public up into a frenzy against the Spanish, who were putting those Cubans and rounding them up and putting them in concentration camps. And so American newspapers, whipped up the American public by reporting very sensational stories. And by sensational stories, I mean some of them were true, some of them were untrue, but they were very some of them were exaggerated and really descriptive, right? As we read from that primary source on Friday, very descriptive, and they cause people to get upset and outraged. And so this practice is called yellow journalism, when American newspapers did that, when they published both true and untrue sensational stories to try to get the public upset. And so the oppressed Cubans, they claimed that these oppressed Cubans were suffering at the hands of European tyrants, just as the United States had suffered before the American Revolution. That's what some of these journalists were saying. And as this is all going on, in order to protect Americans and their assets in Cuba during this chaos, during this chaotic time, the United States sent the warship USS Maine into Havana Harbor. And just 9 days after it arrived, the Maine exploded, as we learned, killing 260 American sailors. And the Spanish claimed that the explosion had been the result of a malfunction aboard the ship. And actually, research has shown that they were true. They're telling the truth, that this is actually correct, that the explosion was the result of a malfunction. But Americans at the time were convinced that the Maine had been destroyed by Spanish sabotage. So, after a few attempts at mediating the dispute, trying to calm everybody down and to, maintain some sort of peace, it didn't really work. Those attempts didn't really work. And the United States ended up declaring war against Spain on April 11th, 1898. And in order to prevent the possibility of the United States annexing Cuba, Congress passed something called the Teller Amendment. And this amendment proclaimed that the United States would help the Cuban people gain their freedom from Spain, but they would not annex the island and take it as a territory after their victory in the war. So, the Spanish, during this, what some people have called a splendid little war between Spain and America, the Spanish Empire was really no match for the Americans, right? Especially the new American warships. On the seas, United States forces were quickly able to dispatch the Spanish fleet. The Spanish were really surprised when the Americans captured the Philippines, which was a Pacific outpost of the Spanish Empire. And those citizens in the Philippines were also at the time rebelling against Spanish rule. On land, the conflict was not quite so easy. The American military force was composed mainly of volunteers, and these volunteers were not really equipped well for an expedition in the tropics, which is where Cuba is, right? It's down in the Gulf in the Caribbean, and it's a very tropical place. It's a tropical island, and the American military forces, land forces, were not really equipped for this. And there's a future president, Teddy Roosevelt, who we mentioned just a few minutes ago. He had assembled a volunteer cavalry regiment. And a cavalry regiment are soldiers on horseback. That's what they are. And so he assembled this regiment known as the Rough Riders, and they became very famous for a charge that it relied a lot on the support of seasoned African American soldiers who were serving in segregated infantry and cavalry units. But Teddy Roosevelt and his crew, his regiment, were pretty famous for a charge that took place during the Spanish-American War in their attempt to free Cuba. So in 6 weeks' time, United States forces, they were able to take control of the two major remaining Spanish possessions overseas. That was Cuba and the Philippines. So it took about 6 weeks for the United States to do that. And the United States was afraid also that Japan might attempt to take control of Hawaii while the United States was really distracted by Spain. And so because of that, President William McKinley, he signed a resolution which formally annexed Hawaii finally on July 7th, 1898, which is several years after that coup that was attempted by those sugar plantation owners. So, Spain was very weary from the war. They were losing. They were tired. They weren't really a match for the American forces, and they signed an armistice, which is an agreement to stop the fighting, on August 12th, 1898. By the end, fewer than 400 Americans had died, and that's what caused the Secretary of the State at the time, John Hay, he declared the conflict to be a quote unquote splendid little war. And even though it was, only a few hundred Americans had died in the conflict as a result of the conflict directly, more than 5,000 American deaths from disease like malaria and yellow fever actually happened because of the war. So even though it was only a few hundred directly responsible from the conflict itself, they did get diseases. Many Americans got diseases who were down in these tropical areas fighting, and they died from malaria and yellow fever. So let's talk about the consequences of the Spanish-American War. So in the fall and winter of 1898, representatives, diplomats from Spain and the United States, they met together to really hash out the terms of peace. And so in the Treaty of Paris, which is the treaty that ended the war officially, Spain agreed to free Cuba, and they also agreed to cede or to give the islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico to the United States. Additionally, the United States agreed to pay Spain $20 million for the Philippines. So the Spanish wanted the Philippines back because the Americans had actually captured Manila, which was one of the largest cities in the Philippines. The Americans had captured that after the August 12th armistice had been signed because, due to some delayed communications, right? And so Spain wanted those islands back. They wanted the Philippines back. So the United States agreed they would keep the Philippines. America would keep it since they had taken it over. They captured it. But they would pay Spain $20 million for it. So by the end, the United States had officially become an empire in its own right. And it's important to mention no Cuban or Filipino representatives were allowed to participate in these negotiations. So the question is, would the United States uphold its commitment to Cuba's freedom, or was it going to take Spain's place as a distant oppressor? And really, the answer was a bit of both. So, although the United States didn't annex and conquer Cuba and make it a territory of the United States, it did force Cubans to recognize American control in their new constitution. So, in the Platt Amendment, this is very important, the Platt Amendment, that Cuba agreed to permit American diplomatic, economic, and military intervention, and to also lease Guantanamo Bay for American use. And this base, America still controls to this very day. It's down in Cuba. It's Guantanamo Bay, and it's actually where some terrorists have been kept there at a prison there in Guantanamo Bay off the coast of Florida in Cuba itself. And so the United States still leases Guantanamo Bay to this day. For Filipinos who, had allied themselves with U.S. forces and had fought alongside U.S. forces to get rid of Spain, to overthrow Spain, the outcome of the war was really almost like a cruel joke. So although the Americans were, unwilling to allow the Philippines to remain in the control in the hands of the Spanish, the Americans were also unwilling to give Filipinos their own freedom. U.S. politicians like future American President William H. Taft believed that their quote-unquote little brown brothers, the Filipinos, were incapable of self-government. And the Filipinos quickly realized that they had really just traded one imperial power for another. And so they turned their rebellion against the United States. They started to fight back. And for 2 years, the United States fought to put down the Filipino insurrection, to put down the Filipino rebellion. And ironically, the United States resorted to the same tactics that the Spanish had used against the Cubans. So in 1891, the United States defeated the rebels, and the Philippines became an American territory. And what did it really mean to be an American territory? What does it mean even today? It's not quite clear, and it wasn't quite clear back then. So before the Spanish American War, the US had never annexed territory without the expectation that it would achieve eventual statehood. For Puerto Ricans, it meant that, it meant being a territory meant that they had American citizenship eventually, but it meant that they also didn't have self rule, self government. For Filipinos, being a territory meant they neither had citizenship nor independence, so they didn't get either of those things. The only thing that was certain was that after the Spanish American War, the United States wasn't really going to be the same. So it had survived for over 100 years as an isolationist nation, right? And it was an ocean away from all the European powers. And it really emerged as an industrial behemoth in the wake of the Civil War. So with its, defeat of Spain, with its victory over Spain, and now that it's acquired its own empire, the United States had really arrived on the world stage as a major player. So I want to know what you think. Why do you think the U.S. annexed the Philippines and Puerto Rico as territories, right, and not states? So I just mentioned what that meant to be a territory and how it was different for those two places, Philippines and Puerto Rico, and what it meant for the people living there, whether they got citizenship, whether they were to become states, whether they were able to have self-government. Why do you think the US chose to make them territories and not states? I want to know that. So let me know if you have any questions about this assignment, and I'll be sure to help you.